Our next speaker, I'm just going to do it real brief because you can fill in any holes that you need to. But Dr. Stephen Strauss is a distinguished professor of forest biotechnology in the Department of Forest Science at Oregon State University. He also has a joint appointment in the molecular and cellular biology program. So his presentation is entitled GMO Crops Taking the Long View. So I'll turn it over to him. Is the
Thank you.
you won't be rubbing.
I tried to do it for
Okay.
you.
Thank you very much for coming out here. I appreciate it. So some stuff that Ray said, I agree with. Some of it I dramatically disagree with. And I'll try to state some of those points of disagreement as we go along here. And maybe at the end, I have some notes there, try to deal with them one by one. So first thing I want to do is put up some qualifications. I've seen some things on the internet lately. I'm not paid by any biotech companies to be here. I'm not getting funding from them. Not even car fare, nothing. I'm just here because I want to provide whatever information would help you guys make your decision. I'm not representing Oregon State University. I'm a professor there, but it's me giving my view. You'll see I'm favorable to GMOs as a tool. I think Ray was as well. But I don't endorse all GMO crops, all the practices using them. That's a major point of agreement. We should be doing much better than we're doing with them. I value organic agriculture as a choice for consumers. I don't see, from a science point of view, any fundamental problem. It's a market regulation issue. We can coexist scientifically, no problem. But obviously, for people who grow it and grow into markets, there are real financial pains. There can be. A lot of them have not been measured yet, but I think they're real, and I think we need to find solutions for that. And I appreciate that's a serious issue for farmers who might get the value of their crop reduced or rejected as a result of contamination. I think that's a point of agreement. And so we need choices. The governor of Oregon recently established a GMO task force that I'm on, and there's a lot of organic agriculture folks on it as well as conventional, and we're trying to come up with advice for him about what might be workable solutions. But when the governor met with us a couple of weeks ago, his comment was, I don't expect consensus. I expect some general ideas, because this area is so divisive, there's probably no simple paths forward. So my focus is on science, not law or economics. I'm going to try to avoid value judgments to the extent that I can and say whether something is good or bad. I'm sure that I won't be perfect there. And I'm also going to talk about broader stuff, like Ray did with golden rice, because I think the message Jackson County and Oregon sends to the world about this is important. It's significant. That's maybe far more significant than whatever happens locally. So I think we need to keep the big picture in mind. So these are my key messages. If you want to go to sleep after this and explain yourself the details, you can do that. GMOs are not one thing. So there's consensus about that worldwide. Ecologists, crop scientists, you name it. They say look at it case by case. Don't adopt them happily. Don't throw them out as a group. Of course, you're talking about throwing them out as a group. So from a strict science perspective, that is against scientific consensus. But that doesn't mean doesn't make sense economically or on other bases. But from a science point of view, that does not make sense. And there's good consensus on that. As Ray also said, I think is correct, it's really helpful to separate the science of doing it, the technology of accomplishing something, higher antioxidants, whatever it might be, from how you manage it, how you regulate it. And again, the question, this is sort of a baby and bathwater question. If you've created something that's good, but you're not managing it that well, do you want to throw it out entirely because the bathwater is dirty? As you'll see, I think it's important to consider the context. We do crazy stuff in conventional breeding all the time. Some of those genes that Ray was talking about coming from grapes, that often involves very wide crosses and a lot of chromosomal disruption and duplication and doubling. I'll show you a couple of examples. So GMOs are sometimes viewed as this radical departure in breeding, and in a lot of ways there's a lot of similarities. and I'll show you that in a minute. There's a lot of sensationalized science, I have to say. Sorry, Ray, but I think you showed us some of that. There's a lot of internet myths out there, and so we got to be really cautious about what we get from the internet, what we get from groups that are rabidly anti-GMO as a matter of philosophy. From my point of view, the answer is to coexist, to try to seek solutions that preserve freedom to farm for everybody, and I'll come back to that very briefly at the end. So this is what I want to cover here. I want to say a little bit about why I might know something about this. You can be the judge at the end. Talk about GMOs relative to conventional breeding. Talk about the record in summary in the world and in the United States. Talk about the problems in management, which have been significant, as Ray said. Talk about, is GE food safe? What do we think? That's the biggest issue to consumers. And then, again, coexistence. So who am I? I do research on cottonwood trees. These are, as long as you harvest them before 12 or 14 years, these are agricultural crops in Oregon. So I'm an agricultural geneticist and biotechnologist in that sense. So I'm in the College of Forestry at Oregon State. That's the box. But I basically do ag biotech with these trees. And I've been doing that for a lot of years, both conventional genetics, genomics, and genetic engineering. For 8 years, I was director of an outreach and biotech program based at Oregon State, based in the College of Agricultural Sciences, where among other things, we had a lecture series and brought in all kinds of great speakers, including ecologists and environmentalists and organic farmers, to talk about these issues and what's true and what's not true and paths forward. So that's given me a fair bit of familiarity with the issue. And then I'm sort of a mini farmer. I've been doing field trials of different kinds of poplars, up to about 10 acres of experimentation, so I have some understanding of what farmers deal with in trying to manage weeds, manage irrigation, manage insect pests. And I know, as Ray said, how very difficult it can be. So what are GMOs? Let's talk about conventional breeding some. So a lot of the crops we have, I think there's one general misunderstanding in the general public often is that, crops are natural and GMOs are unnatural. Well, in fact, many of the crops we have been radically modified in their chemistry and their behavior and their genetic constitution. Some of the most prominent examples are corn from maize, which in its natural form is photosynthesis, essentially inedible. So this really is a genetic creation through earlier methods, not genetic engineering, but earlier pre-scientific methods. In fact, banana is another one that's an extra chromosome, triploidy, so chromosome engineering, making it sterile so you don't have the seeds that otherwise make it inedible. And we could talk more about these other crops that the wild relatives are often poisonous, toxic, extremely low yielding, radical changes in their chromosomal constitution, gene additions, gene deletions, and so forth. Another example is the brassicas, where you have things like broccoli and cauliflower, that again, due to a few genes in this case that we've now characterized, true mutants, natural mutants, you've created these amazingly nutritious crops that the only thing left to do, I think, is to figure out how to add a gene to get kids to like to eat them. Haven't figured that one out yet. But again, radical genetic engineering, and sometimes when we don't have the diversity, when we scan all kinds of species, anything we can make a cross between, often on different continents with different chromosomal constitutions. We do embryo rescue and all kinds of very unnatural things to produce these mutants. Sometimes we resort to irradiation or mutagenesis with chemicals to try to produce more mutant varieties. And those, of course, are not discriminant. Those are mutating the whole genome and trying to sort through it. So about 2,000 crop varieties are derived from this. So apart from knowing this is kind of a comparative baseline, so we don't disproportionately at least freak out about GMOs, some of these techniques overlap with what's in the ballot measure as I read it, where we talk about we shouldn't do unnatural gene doubling, gene deletion, chromosomal changes. Well, we already have been doing that kind of thing. And so it's not clear to me legally if they've drawn the line properly. So one of the problems you may have with the ballot measure is how it's interpreted and whether there's legal fights over whether some of the mutated crops grown in organic agriculture might be classified as GMOs. I'm not sure. I read the measure again yesterday and this morning, and I think it's ambiguous, but that's up to lawyers to make the final decision about. So grafting is another one. We now know when you graft, a little bit of DNA moves from the graft up into the scion. Is that an unnatural genetic modification that would obviously affect organic growers if you do grafting, like in apple and pear orchards? So concerns that maybe the ballot measure wasn't written quite right, which would be a real concern, the implementation and the cost thereof. So final message is that this stuff I've been telling you about is not the past, and we don't do that anymore. We still do radical genetics all the time, and it's picking up in speed. The ability to sequence genomes cheaply and rapidly. We can scan genomes of all kinds of species that would never mate with a crop normally, find just the individual genes, move them in, change whole genomes much faster than ever before. So if genetics worries you, and indeed lots of the wild relatives of crops are highly toxic and maladapted, we're doing stuff that would give a scientist concern. Scientists generally don't worry about the method as much as they worry about the consequences, the chemistry, the safety, and that's kind of the baseline. That we do a lot of crazy stuff, and right now there's no regulation anywhere in the world about it. Maybe Canada would be a minor exception, because Canada regulates not based on the method, but based on its novelty. The rest of the world is hung up on the method, and I would say mainly for political reasons, Ray, but also for cultural reasons. So there's the question, will any of these things be restricted by the ballot measure? Unclear, but I think it's a serious question. Is that somebody's phone?
Yeah.
Somebody disagreeing with me already? So what is genetic engineering? Good to have clear. Genetic engineering is not taking a gene from some faraway place and moving it. It's that, and it's a lot of other things. It's basically, in conventional breeding, we cross stuff. These are chromosomes that we combine. We're often crossing stuff, as I said, from all over the place, because we want to get maximum diversity and then sort through all this diversity. With genetic engineering, we figure out how the trait works, isolate the gene, modify it, and then asexually introduce it. And I'll show you as you go along. There's a lot of interest because breeding of some of our crops naturally can be very difficult for using the GMO process to move and modify natural genes and get desirable traits. And I'll show you a couple of examples of that. So again, it's the method, and the method is definitely useful and increases efficiency in a number of cases. So it's not always taking a gene from a wild place. This is what it looks like. These are from poplar trees in my own laboratory. Through tricks of science, you insert a gene into an individual somatic cell. You induce it by your tissue culture conditions to regenerate into a plant. So from a single cell, you get a shoot. Sometimes you have a shoot and a root at the same time that has the new gene in every cell. And then through routine horticulture, you put roots on and you acclimate it to soil, you vegetatively propagate it, or you go through seeds, and you put it out in the field and see if it's healthy and normal and gives you the trait you wanted. These are two cottonwood trees that differ. One of them is transgenic and one of them is the controls, and there was no obvious expression differences of the trait this particular year, so they look the same. But that's what it looks like. So when you do genetic engineering, you tend to modify a few genes. So organisms have 20, 50,000, depending on the size of the genome. You're modifying a very, very few. Something like 1 foot of DNA is changed between Corvallis and Seattle, just to give you some sense of scale for the size of the genome. So you're really tinkering. You're not engineering like you're building a new bridge engineering. You're tinkering at the margins of this amazing complex organism. We're not creating new organisms, novel things. And that's also a common public misunderstanding. So GE record in brief around the world and looking at some traits that are just here or coming beside the big ones that would all be precluded by the ballot measure. So as Ray did, I'm going to depend a little bit on this report, and I'll scrutinize some of the things he said, I think, as we go, because I'm not trying to selectively take out quotes that mislead, not at all. So I think this is a credible, very recent report about the state in the USA. And on an international scale, this group, based at Cornell, it's a nonprofit that tries to track what's going on globally. So we'll look at both a little bit. And those are the two main sources of information. So when you look around the world, since about 1996, you've had this uptake of GE crops. This is about 25 countries that are doing it. And it's called the most rapidly adopted innovation in the history of agriculture. Faster than hybrid corn, faster than the plow. So there's a lot of farmers who think there's value here. Interestingly, the amount of land in the developing world, places like India and China, now slightly outpaced that in the developed world, places like Canada and the United States. So the notion that these crops are just for mega agriculture, agribusiness, we know is now flat wrong. A lot of these are very small farmers growing small plots of land. So when you look globally, how much land this is, it's something like 10 to 15% of all the arable land on the planet. So plowed land, arable land is what I mean by that. So it's not a new, novel, crazy thing. It's not something that most everybody rejects because it's done on a massive scale around the world. There are many countries that are having trouble with it, including in Europe, obviously, as you know. But it's already very, very big. So we have to recognize, in my opinion, that there are a lot of people who think this is okay and good and valuable. And the real issue is coexistence as we go forward. So two traits dominate. I think you know herbicide tolerance, mostly Roundup, but also other herbicides. And insect resistance, mostly the Bt gene from Bacillus thuringiensis, widely used as an organic pesticide. But now taking the pesticide out of the bacterium and putting it into the plant. So you have to bite the plant to get the toxin. And we can talk about that in detail. A lot of now, increasingly, 90% of the corn now have stacked traits, meaning they have 2 or more genes, often more than one insect resistance gene to give more robust resistance or resistance to more pests. So, and we'll talk about that in a second. So I'm not going to get into details here, but so this amazing uptake is occurring despite about a 50% increase in the price. So farmers, I don't think the farmers is dumb. I think of them as being very conservative and practical, are paying quite a bit more for that. So the assumption is they're perceiving that there's value. So a lot of what you see in the internet is very, very negative. Ray cited a number of those, what I would consider to be extreme negative websites as sources of his information. I tend to not believe what I see there. I try to go to places like this, the mainstream scientific journals, and places like the National Academy of Sciences that tries to put together diverse groups of the top scientists to assess a complex issue. So these have both concluded largely that there have been very large positive environmental impacts to date of GE crops. And there's also problems, and I'll talk about that as we go along. But the message is, in my view, mostly positive so far. And it's for two reasons. One is, for these insect-resistant crops, a rather dramatic reduction in the use of insecticides. And this is from that USDA report, so you can see it yourself. You can see it's variable up and down. But the report says that this is mainly due to insect-resistant GE crops, that you've got this reduction. And because these crops are so widely grown and they use quite a lot of insecticides, particularly cotton, it's a big reduction in active ingredient insecticides. It's a big environmental benefit, not a little one. The other benefit that's talked about widely is the promotion of no or low-till agriculture by herbicide-resistant crops. And I think there's a scientific consensus that no or low-till is good. Tillage disturbs the soil, disturbs wildlife habitat, makes soils prone to erosion, compacts the soil, reduces organic matter as it helps the oxidation, and all of that driving over the soils, plowing them up, releases more greenhouse gases to the environment. The ISAA globally estimated that in 2012, the increased no-till, no and low-till, was equivalent to 13 million cars off the road. So it's a pretty big deal. So this is the other major advantage, and we'll talk more about that. So this is from the report, and the amount of use, the amount to which conservation tillage is promoted by GE varies from crop to crop and year to year. This is soybean, and so here what you see is this is conventional tillage. These are conventional varieties, so mostly conventional tillage. When you have conventional varieties, you have herbicide-tolerant varieties, you have relatively little conventional tillage, and lots of no-till. So that's the data they're talking about, that it promotes it. It's not essential for it, but it makes it easier for farmers to do it, for obvious reasons. So yield is a place that Ray and I differ, and the first thing to say is that these genes were not put in there to increase yield. So to put up yield as a straw man and say, see, we didn't do it, these are not yield genes. These don't improve intrinsic yield. They were there to increase the efficiency of management and reduce costs, reduce use of things like pesticides, promote use of things like herbicides that are more effective or have lower environmental impact. Now, it's not surprising you have a little bit of yield benefit if you do control pests a little better, but usually you're doing other things instead, like using more insecticides, like you just saw. So the yield might be the same. So this is a paper that looked very rigorous. I read it carefully, looked at several hundred studies early in the adoption of GMO. When you're first adopting it around the world, farmers will have a GMO and a non-GMO. Now in most places it's all GMO, and it's hard to make a comparison. So this is the very first look at what the benefits might be. So you can read this, and there's many cases where the yields are negative, many cases where they're positive. On net, over all the studies, the yield benefit in the developed countries like the US was positive, about 6%. Not impressive, but pretty good when you don't expect really any. That's not why these genes were put in there. When you look in the developing countries, the yield benefit's very big, 30%. Because in many cases, this is the way you're controlling pests, having the technology, particularly BT, whereas you weren't doing it or doing it very ineffectively otherwise. When you look at who is benefiting in the developing world, a lot of the women do agriculture, and they were the ones who got the most personal benefit in terms of the time it took, the toil it took, and so forth, the amount of pesticide they were exposed to compared to men. So it looked like there was a sociological benefit. So in the USDA report, and we'll talk about the details, so this is what it said. So now I told you we have stacked traits. And they say that the yield advantage, so they say there is a yield advantage of BT corn and BT cotton over conventional seed has become larger in recent years. It already exists, it's become larger as these traits have become incorporated and stacked. So multiple genes, not really surprising. Another thing is GMOs have advanced. We're getting the genes into better backgrounds. These genes are bred. The early years they were often in genetic backgrounds that weren't the very best varieties because that takes time to do the breeding. That's probably another reason it's getting better. And so they say planting BT corn and BT cotton continues to be more profitable as measured by net returns than planting conventional seeds. One other important difference when you think about yield, and you saw this in Ray's quote, they talk about yield potential. That's the inherent potential once you remove all the pests and limiting factors. And we agree that's not what these genes have been about. These genes are not about increasing intrinsic yield potential. They've been about helping management and increasing net yield, which includes the hazards, the things that might harm a plant. So intrinsic yield, we have no yield genes in plants yet that I know about. And that's hard to do, and I think most breeders would say conventional breeding is the way to do that because it's very, very complex. But things, obviously, when you remove a disease pressure, as you'll see in papaya dramatically, obviously yield is affected as well, but we don't call it yield potential. And Ray's quote was talking about yield potential, so that's a very different thing. So in that same report, there were survey data that were reported by users. Simply asked farmers, why do you grow these things? Obviously, they cost you more. And with that regard to the particular gene, herbicide tolerance, BT, insect tolerance, or the crop, the large majority of farmers say it's for yield benefit. So they perceive it. It's often hard to measure, particularly these days, that everything seems to be GMO for a lot of these farmers. But they perceive a yield benefit. So I believe there is one, even though that was not the main goal. So at a global level, stepping back, ISSA, this is what they estimate as farm gate value, about $117 billion. And they estimate that the farmers in the developing world who've done this, that there's about 16 million of them. If you include their families, that's 65 million who have significantly benefited economically from the higher efficiency, higher productivity, lower insecticide use for the BT crops. So that's big in my view. So what I have here coming up, I'm going to go through this quickly because there's not much time, is, it's not all about herbicide tolerance and BT. And I agree with Ray, you'll see that we really haven't managed the herbicide tolerant crops very well. There's a lot of other stuff that's being produced with GMO technology that would all be foreclosed by the measure. So things like papaya, putting a little bit of DNA from the virus in, immunizes the plant in a way analogous to vaccination, but different detailed scientific mechanism, literally saved the papaya industry from ring spot virus that was epidemic. So, and that's been done now in plums, and that's been used in many crops to modify their composition. I'll show you an example or two. Drought tolerance, obviously drought is a huge issue. Whatever you believe is causing climate change, we tend to agree that the climate's going to get droughtier in most places in the summer, more variable, and so conventional breeders are working hard to try to produce more robust crops. God bless them. Can you supplement that with GMOs? And it looks like, according to DuPont and Monsanto, that you can. And so they have genes, not on a large scale, and I don't think we really know the answer as to whether they're really or not. Every year, droughts are different. Plants experience them differently depending on the soil, depending on the time of year they happen. So it takes many years of data to figure out if these things are really helping or not. But these companies think that GMOs also have some tools that may help plants survive and produce under severe droughts. These are also been provided free of charge in Africa, I understand, because Africa is almost perpetually under drought, many parts of it. And so I think that's a humanitarian gesture by these companies. Purple tomatoes, Ray said, and I'll mention here, my colleague at Oregon State, Jim Myers, has released these purple tomatoes. You can buy them now. There's a variety that's been produced through GM techniques that is more purple. It's purple throughout the skin, has higher levels of these same antioxidants, high enough that we now know that it helps them resist rot, so they last longer. They're healthier, presumably, in terms of anthocyanin levels, and they don't rot as fast, as you can see in this image. Now, at least for me, that's what happens to about half of my beloved cherry tomatoes, whether I grow them or whether I buy them at the farmer's market. So this would seem to be something that might be really useful. And maybe you can do it through conventional breeding if you work hard enough, but it's a lot easier and more efficient with GMOs. So that may come on the market in a couple of years. By turning down a gene using that same vaccination-like technology, we've been able to produce soy oils that look like they're much healthier for several reasons. They resemble olive oil a lot, and that may come in the market this year for the first time. Another kind of soy oil modification done by the big companies is to produce higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids, which we think promote brain health and heart health. So that also might be nice to have a healthier soy available routinely. Company in Idaho, Simplot, they have a little division called Simplot Plant Sciences, which is devoted to modifying potato using potato genes, not introducing genes from afar, for the reasons Ray mentioned that many people just don't like it. And so they're just using potato genes, turning them down, or bringing in genes from wild relatives. So here you see a case where they've turned down a gene that causes browning and causes a lot of potatoes to be disposed of. As you may know, food waste is one of the biggest environmental problems we have. And then also turns down a chemical in them that when you fry them produces acrylamide. And then, it's a very, very toxic component of food. So it reduces it much lower, and that's what you see right here compared to conventional potatoes. And because of the GMO technique, you can do this in established potato varieties. Farmers know, McDonald's knows, the public knows. You don't need to rebreed from scratch. And breeding potatoes is very, very difficult because of their sterility or near sterility. So it's much faster as well as more precise. So the other thing that they're saying is in second generation, should be out in a couple of years, they've taken a gene from a wild potato for late blight resistance. So this is a devastating disease. Lots of fungicides are used now in the large majority of potato production that presumably you would not need to use at all if you had this gene or this gene and other genes that will eventually come with this technique. And this late blight was the causative agent of potato famine blight. This is a disease that caused the devastation in Idaho. So it's always been a big one for potato growers. So again, even though this is a native gene, it could be bred in. It would be very difficult and time consuming. With the GM technique, you can grab it, map it, grab it, insert it, and put it right in, so much more efficient. They also put in a gene that reduces production of sugar during storage of potatoes that causes premature sprouting and therefore a lot of waste of potatoes. A little closer to my heart is a tree guy. We have lots of tree diseases. We have them here, things like sudden oak death. We have them in the East Coast, all kinds of syndromes. And the best known one is something called chestnut blight that actually devastated chestnut throughout its range. Gorgeous forests of trees that look like this, ended up looking like this starting in about 1912. And we've been trying to breed resistance for nearly 100 years. There's actually some great signs that we're getting close with conventional breeding. It's very slow, making hybrids with Chinese chestnut and many generations of back crossing. And there's a gene for resistance from wheat that we've been eating all along that looks like it gets right at the mechanism. So can we use this gene to give a broader base of resistance, use both conventional breeding and genetic engineering? And so one thing I'll just ask you, so this is not like the other applications that are about farms or plantations or orchards. This is about helping restore a wild tree. This is about producing a resistant chestnut using genetic engineering and breeding, and then releasing it into the wild. And my question for you is, do you support that? Would you accept the transgenic light-resistant chestnut for restoration, or would you not? I just wonder how many people would support it. Anybody?
I want to know if the seeds that fall from that tree will grow.
They will grow. That's actually been established.
They're not sterile.
They're not sterile. There's no sterile crops grown anywhere in the whole world. That kind of technology has been developed to a limited extent and then abandoned by Monsanto and the other companies as socially unacceptable at this point. So they would be perfectly fertile.
Well, I've heard of situations where that was the case.
Yeah, well, it's not true. I mean, through conventional breeding, we breed hybrid. What's that?
They were before, but not now.
It was just in a laboratory. It never got out into the marketplace, period. But you have things like banana that is essentially sterile, but that's conventional breeding.
Exactly.
You have hybrid corn. That's not sterile, but the corn is so variable, nobody saves the seed, or very few farmers do, some do. So those are kind of conventional sterility-like. But in genetic engineering, no one's done it, because it's not acceptable right now.
But in foreign countries, it's a thing that they do is save seeds often.
Yeah, exactly, and I think it's a bad business model to try to sell seed to a place where people don't have the money to buy them. So the notion that we're going to take over the developing world by making their seeds sterile and forcing them to buy it when these folks are too poor anyway, that's really
That's
quite
my
neat.
concern.
Yeah, and that's not, as far as I know, that's not going on. So, you know, the golden rice that Ray talked about, very different takes on it. There's nonprofits like the Gates Foundation funding the ability to give it away for free to farmers. That's how golden rice is going to largely be used.
Would you say people don't save corn seeds?
No, some people do. That's a small minority in the developed world.
No, in Jackson County we save corn
Yeah,
seeds.
well, that's fantastic. Yeah.
But we have a $10,000 contract to save corn seeds, I'm just saying.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Thank you. I didn't know you were here. Yeah, so that's definitely done. I don't know what proportion of the corn is in the United States. I would guess less than 1%. That's why I kind of didn't treat it. So my apologies. So anyway, anybody who would not accept transgenic light-resistant chestnut, please. Thank you very much. So I'm going to guess that's 10%, something like that. Or 15%? Go ahead, 20%? I don't know.
They're not in 2 minutes, I mean.
Yeah, this is
I would have to.
now this is a very scientific study we have going on here. Yeah, I understand,
You
right?
show me a picture of a tree and then you say, would you accept it? Well, that's the same thing that's happening to our food. No.
Yeah, so that's how you vote, and that's fine. And I'm guessing it was like 80-20 based on this rigorous scientific study.
Like that's.
79-21. I'm just trying to get a sense. I've been doing this in my talks lately to get a sense. I did it in Eugene. It was about 90-10, 80-20. I'm just trying to get a sense of, what do people accept in concept? Given the cultural barriers and other concerns people have about GMOs, is it just off the table? That's really what I'm getting at. Anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked into this. I apologize for this rigorous study, but I'll repeat it, I assure you. I'm just trying to get a sense of where people are at in my different audiences, that's all. So far, the majority are okay with it, but obviously we need to know a lot more, to make a real decision, no question about it. So golden rice, in contrast to what Ray said, is not crazy and novel. We're doing biofortification with things like golden rice already, produced using conventional genetics. And you already heard from him, the goal is to produce beta-carotene to deal with nutrient deficiency. Why do you want to do that? Because despite the supplements we're doing, and by the way, the Helen Keller Foundation is collaborating on golden rice because they believe it, Ray. They believe it can be an important part of the solution because the supplements don't fully work. A lot of these places don't even have rows that you can drive on much of the year, let alone literate people. So the reason that to develop this as another tool, there are no silver bullets out there in the world, as I think you all know, but as a tool is because it's devastating currently with the supplements we do, with our attempts to diversify diets. This is the poor of the poor that we're addressing with this. And you can look at these numbers and they scare the hell out of me. 1/3 of children under the age of 5 around the world have vitamin A deficiency, affecting 670,000 children under 5 annually. 1/4 to 500,000 children in developing countries become blind each year. This is with supplementation. So it would be nice to have another tool. And whether you consider this a pharmaceutical or whether you consider this more like conventional breeding, and I have another couple of slides I used to show that we're already doing this with conventional breeding. We've done it with sweet potato, we've done it with corn, we've done it with cauliflower. It's happening now. Millions of families have benefited from this with conventional breeding. But sometimes the levels are not high enough. Sometimes crops like cassava are too hard to breed. And some crops like rice don't seem to have natural diversity for vitamin A in the kernel. So you turn to genetic engineering. So about a half a serving a day would give you enough. And right, I would say with the same arguments of toxicity, I'd say we should ban carrots and make those pharmaceuticals. You eat too many, you get too much vitamin A. Bad things can happen. Obviously, the public has to learn how to use them. And that's part of the extension education process going on in the Philippines in conjunction with the field trials. And by the way, those field trials that were vandalized, that was organized from Europe activists. That was not local people saying we don't want vitamin A. So anyway, a economist at Berkeley and his team recently estimated what delays of cost. Given that vitamin A, even the earlier forms with lower amounts, you don't need to eat a mountain. That was a Greenpeace myth, one of many. If this had been available about 10 years ago, recognizing that we eat things enriched in vitamin A all the time, if we got it out to people, and you could read this paper, there are conservative estimates in it, he estimates this 10-year delay that's largely political and regulatory. No, it's not science. It's largely political and regulatory. About $1 billion in lost productivity of people who are sick, who can't perform economically. About 1 million cases of blindness, several 100,000 deaths. So I can't live with those numbers. Perhaps you can, Ray. I cannot live with those numbers because I know this rice could be consumed safely if people are educated and there's extension to explain to them what it is. And it probably wouldn't be their only source of rice. So moving on, problems in management. Here we're going to have more agreement. So we've used this glyphosate resistance. We've gotten these no-till benefits that are quite huge. But we've been so zealous, we as a country, and farmers who save money and control weeds better and simplify their life and go to their kids' soccer game again because they have one tool. And the companies who sell the seeds, this is money. This is a lot of money fast because farmers really love this stuff. We've overused it. We've loved it to death. So now we have lots of cases of Roundup-resistant weeds. And I think Monsanto was negligent in stewarding this product forward. I'm angry about that. And I've confronted them at conferences, and they pretty much own it, that they did not do a good job. This is not good. And now the benefits of glyphosate as your primary weed control are now being eroded. So thing to keep in mind about this is not good. I don't think anybody would call this sustainable agriculture. We should know better by now to do this smarter. But it's not new. So this is a little graph from a paper in Nature, one of the preeminent journals of science, talking about herbicide-resistant crops in the past. It's happened many, many times. More than 300 cases are known, independent evolution, and this is now the Roundup case, which is fast. And it's embarrassing. And so we need to figure out how to manage those much, much better. But it's an old problem of agriculture. It's not a new problem. It's been exacerbated by GMOs, unfortunately. Bad management, we agree. Another thing about that, and this is from the USDA report, is that the advantages, ecotoxicology-wise, of herbicide-resistant crops, they can reduce or they can increase herbicide use. They can reduce the ecological toxicity depending on which herbicide you're using and how much. So this is one case, herbicide-tolerant corn, adopters versus non-adopters. So for many years, they were using less herbicide. Recently, they're using about the same amount of herbicide, and that's probably because they can't just rely on Roundup anymore. So that's an example of the erosion of a benefit that we had earlier, and that is not nice. That is unfortunate. So insect-resistant crops, I think everybody will agree, they've been managed much better, and that's primarily thanks to the Environmental Protection Agency. Thank you, Ray. He's an EPA guy. So, or was an EPA guy. So when you look at insect-resistant crops, you can see two things. One is that, yes, resistance is developing here. There's 5 cases known that have economic significance, but they're still very small and isolated. It hasn't been the explosion of issue that it has been for herbicide-tolerant crops. As we stack genes, hopefully we can slow this down. But when you look at the billion acres that we've grown and how we've managed it, this may be about as good as we can do. Maybe we could have done a little better, but every scientist said eventually there'll be resistance developed, just like they do to the antibiotics we use in medicine and veterinary agriculture. So being realistic in the real world of evolution, not in some laboratory, we know we're going to get pests develop resistance. The question is, can you manage it smartly so it happens at a rate that maybe we can manage? So I think we've done better. I think here as well, and this is a matter of opinion, scientists will differ whether we should have done much better than this, or maybe this is about as good as can be expected given the balance of science and economic reality. But also, we have resistance developing, and we need to be cognizant about it. So the issue is we don't have silver bullets. No one has silver bullets that I know of. The issue is, can you use these tools intelligently to get benefit while nature reacts? Can you use them more smartly, combining them with biocontrol, for example? And these BT crops are better for biocontrol because you use less insecticide sprays, and those tend to kill biocontrol agents. Can you combine tactics so you can get the benefits of this prolonged and also integrate it with other practices? So we're doing better here. So again, perspective, this is not a new problem. A week or two ago, there was a paper in Entomology Today saying, well, it's the 100th anniversary of this. Nothing to be proud of, but it's been going on forever and ever in agriculture. Another issue that concerns me, and this is a hypothesis, this is not proven, but I think it's a reasonable one, so I put it up here, is we have done a better job in weed control, the resistant weeds notwithstanding, and one of the weeds we seem to have controlled better is the milkweed, and the monarch butterfly depends on the milkweed. So its numbers are very low. There could be lots of reasons for that, including what's happening in Mexico where they over. But a concern by many scientists is that we've driven milkweed populations to such low levels with herbicide-tolerant crops that that's threatening the population. And so we may, from my point of view, that wouldn't be a reason to ban all GMOs. That would be a reason to manage more smartly. Plant milkweed, pay farmers to have refugia for milkweed, various tactics of that sort. I'd love to see, in fact, that is happening already in some localities, planting milkweed along roads. I'd like to see a lot more of that. So the thing that worries consumers the most, individual consumers, not agriculturalists, is it safe? Is it killing me? And from my point of view, the reason this has come up is because there have been several studies, both on the GMO and the glyphosate front, and I'll talk about that a little bit, highly publicized. You know, we almost have no science journalists in the world. Science journalists from every newspaper I know of, apart from a couple at the New York Times, have been fired. They don't exist. So when a journalist sees information, they can't tell if it's good science, bad science, who even to call to check it out. So in my view, one of the reasons that really bad pieces of science like this one can get so publicized, apart from the fact that he engineered the publicity, and is a known anti-GMO advocate for many, many years, is the structure of our journalism these days and the structure of the media. Anyway, this is a study that many scientists said this is really bad toxicology. Right from the get-go, the numbers were too small, statistical analysis was not done. He communicated it unethically by not letting anybody with concerns even see the data until it was out, so on and so forth. And finally, the journal retracted it. Said it was bad enough that it gives no information of value. We're deciding it's not even valid science. So that just shows how bad it was. And there's several studies like that. And there's also lots of other myths out there on the internet. We'll talk about one or two more. We've also talked about some. Another one is that GMO crops have promoted suicide in among farmers in India. GMO cotton, insect-resistant cotton, it's making them, they're paying so much money for it, they have to mortgage their lives and they kill themselves. It's a myth. People who work in India know it's a myth, and you look at data, this is the rate of suicide in India, this is the advent of GMO cotton. No correlation. But it's out there, and many people I talk to, people in my classes, assume it's true. It's not. This is from, again, Nature, the same article, but it's in many, many places. So you have all kinds of stuff. In longer talks, I talk about some of the documentaries and the crazy stuff that's in there. No time for that today. So one place, there's many places in the internet you can go, many websites to try to get what I consider to be legitimate scientific information without a strong bias. Here's one that from Professor Parrott that also explains for several of these studies, here's the one I just told you about that was retracted, why he believes, and many scientists believe, the science is just poor and shouldn't be taken seriously. So it's often said that, all the data is from Monsanto, there's no independent studies. Ray talked about correctly that farmers sign a contract when they use these seeds, when they rent them. They don't buy them, they rent them. That's what Monsanto allows you to do, like it or not. You don't have to do it, but if you're going to get their seeds, you rent them, you don't buy them. That says you won't do research on them. Now, I don't like that very much. I think that's kind of almost constitutionally illegitimate, but it's a contract. It's not national law. In a contract, you can put anything. And if somebody signs it, pretty much, that's the law. So that's what Monsanto has done, and it makes it harder to do independent studies. But a lot of scientists do it anyway. There have been lots of studies that have been done on these commercialized crops. The scientists just want to do it, and Monsanto generally won't suffer the bad publicity of suing a real scientist doing studies. So there's a lot of stuff out there anyway. So this is one recent paper looking at the safety of GM crops, food and feed. The lower three bars here are things that have to do with the composition and the safety of food. Probably 10% or so of those are reviews, they're not independent studies. This would suggest there's something like 30 papers per year, about 300, maybe more, maybe less, that have to do with safety of food. There's actually a lot more. This is just a 10-year period. There'd be a similar number in the previous 10-year period. And this is what these scientists from Italy said. They say the experimental data collected so far on authorized GE crops can be summarized as follows: no evidence of toxic or allergenic effects. And now that doesn't mean we couldn't do something like that, but they've either not been done by the companies, because it would be really bad business, or they've been caught by regulatory and stopped. So far, the method and the ones we've produced, as far as I can see, appear to be completely safe. The other group that supports that, again, groups of scientists coming together, more powerful than 1, 2, or 3 studies, even if they're good studies, is to places like this that have come out, the European Commission. Europe is not anti-GMO from a science perspective. It's the political process there that makes it almost impossible to grow GMO crops. The Royal Society of Medicine from the UK, our National Academy of Sciences, American Medical Association, and so forth. And there's more here. Society for Toxicology and so forth. So I think it's true, and I don't really see significant deviation from mainstream science that the current crops are safe. That's how I read it. So I just want to mention very briefly about glyphosate. I'm not a toxicologist, but I teach with a toxicologist. I consult with the chair of toxicology at OSU. I consult with toxicologists around the country. When a paper comes out, like Ray talked about, that appears to show that glyphosate is highly dangerous, I say, what's going on? Is this true? Because I'm not in a great position to evaluate it. And the background to that, so far, I've got no indication any of these new studies are strong enough to say there's really an issue. And you also have to keep in mind as you think about these new studies that Ray talked about, is that there's a mountain of studies already. This is a review by a scientist at New York Medical College of hundreds of studies of glyphosate, and this is what they write in the summary. Reviews of the safety of glyphosate and Roundup have been conducted by several regulatory agencies and scientific institutions worldwide, and have concluded there is no indication of any human health concern. So it's groups of scientists, it's also regulators, people like EPA in the US and Japan and the EU, all the people that have allowed it to be used. So there's a mountain of data saying that glyphosate is extremely safe, and you have to get very high concentrations to be concerned, much higher than in the breast milk studies, for example. So, so far, I don't see that this strong scientific consensus has changed. So that's how it doesn't mean glyphosate is one of the most widely used, if not the most widely used herbicide in the world. There's a lot of it out there. There's going to be some effects on amphibians or something because it's used so large on such a wide basis. But what's the alternative? What if you tilled up all those acres versus use Roundup? Would the non-target effects be smaller or larger? I suspect much larger. So last comments, I'm sure I'm running out of time. I should be. Yeah, I'm definitely running out of time. Coexistence. So as Ray said, very correctly, I think, gene flow is ubiquitous in agriculture, with or without GMOs. This is just an image of corn from, I think it's Honduras. A farmer is throwing 3 different colors of corn right next to each other. And yes, they cross-pollinate. If you look close, you can see this yellow, down the yellow called black and white kernels. Nothing is pure, no varieties are pure. FDA has allowances for mold in your food, for insect parts, for feces. Nothing is pure. The question is, what's a workable tolerance that we're safe and agriculture is practical? Another thing Ray mentioned that I disagree with strongly, so Monsanto has sued hundreds of farmers and won in every case, mostly out of court, and they're farmers who've intentionally planted their patented seeds. They have never once, and there was a Supreme Court case where they were being sued by the Organic Trade Commission, or OGTA, or whatever that means, against this thing, and they couldn't find a single case where Monsanto sued for contamination. It was only where the farmer, like Hershey Schmeiser, was contaminated and then used the seed and enriched them. That's the reason he lost. Is he either knew what he was doing or should have known. So the gene flow thing does not allow Monsanto to take over your farm, nor have they ever done that. But that also means if you're selling into a non-GMO market, now you have a new thing you need to do. You need to test for this. You need to see if it's above acceptable levels or not. And that's a new cost imposed on folks who are growing from non-GMO markets. And that's a reality. And I don't like it either. If I was a grower, I'd be pissed as hell. So that's the real consequence of this, not that Monsanto takes over your crop. So this admixture of GMOs and non-GMOs, this is a big thing around the world. Millions and millions of farmers think it gives them benefits. So now we have this hodgepodge of different systems of agriculture, different belief systems, different regulatory systems. So more and more we find GMO stuff and non-GMO stuff, and it creates these big trade disruptions that Ray talked about. And it costs us all millions of dollars. So we need to have a smarter way of dealing with that. And he talked about wheat, and I want to talk about that now. That was a very tiny contaminant, but it almost shut down wheat trade in the US over something we knew was safe and was a tiny contaminant. Is that smart regulation? Is that smart trade policies? I think it's not smart at all. We need to have a way to coexist and have tolerances for each other's modes of agriculture. So I'm going to end by just saying, other groups, diverse groups of organic and non-GMO and GMO farmers have gotten together several times, in fact, and reported to the Secretary of Agriculture, much like we're trying to do now with John Kitzhaber, and thought about this. And there's very, very few points of consensus. These really are like different religions trying to talk to each other and come up with a system. So it's very challenging. But I'm going to give you the one quote that they did all agree on. So all members acknowledge the premise that agricultural practices are diverse, and we need to enhance coexistence between all sectors. That's important. They also agree that American farmers have the right to make the best choice for their own farms, including the choice to grow GE, identity preserved IP, non-GE, or organic crops, the choice to practice different agricultural management systems, and the choice to grow crops with many new functional traits, like high antioxidants. So we want all that. We want all that choice and all that freedom, and we all agree that's the way it ought to be. It shouldn't be one way or the other. So finally, to end, these are again my messages. Again, banning or loving GMOs as a group is against science. It's case by case. Think about the science, and Ray made this point very nicely, separate from the management. We've managed some of these badly. Hopefully we're going to learn from that. Consider the context. We do crazy things with breathing all the time for benefit. These may even conflict with your ballot measure. Hard to say at this point. Be wary of sensationalized science. Few studies. Look at the big picture. Be careful on the internet. We all know that. Coexist. from my point of view, I want to see a healthy organic agriculture sector for all that it brings, but seek solutions that allow everybody to farm. And so if I was voting in this county, I would ask myself, given the full sweep of all these things, not just herbicide-tolerant soy, but all these things that are here and coming, and GE is very young, it's only about 20 years old. We haven't even seen all the things that may come. Is it wise to remove this tool from the toolbox? Do you think that's wise for you? Do you think it's a wise signal to the world? Thank you very much.